All right, well, welcome everyone. The meeting is we record these meetings and post them so that if someone is unable to attend and they want to listen later, that it's available. I think this is the 8th meeting of this group since we started, and we welcome all of you and glad you're all here to join us today. My name is Jenna Voss. I am with the County of Orange. I'm kind of pitch hitting in a kind of pseudo facilitator role, more just to introduce our primary topic for the day, which is a focus on one of the key projects within the watershed. So if you don't mind, Annie, next slide. So as I mentioned at the top, while folks were still joining, what we'd like is, if you don't mind, in the chat, especially for anyone who's new to the group who hasn't yet attended one of these meetings, if you could just briefly introduce yourself in the chat, your name, your organization, and especially if you're new, something that you would like to learn from or contribute to as part of this group. For those of you who've participated in the past, your name is there, but for those on the phone, if you'd like to introduce yourself, I'd open it up real quick. You should be able to unmute. I think it's *6. All right, no worries. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
This is Brad Barker. I'm the supervising park ranger at Aliso and Wood Canyons Wilderness Park. So this is my first time to one of these meetings, so just interested to hear what's going on out there in the park. It sounds like it's a good thing to be working on, breaking the stand into kind of more definable areas that can be worked on, define more focused spots. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you. All right, so I think we can go ahead and move on. So very briefly, just to kind of recap the meeting objectives and roles, what we want to do is just briefly touch base on Reach 6, which we talked about a month ago. Reach 6, for just a quick jog your memory, that's, and as Brad just referenced, the lower 5 to 6 miles of Aliso Creek has been broken up into reaches. Reach 6 includes the aquep structure. So there were a couple of alternatives presented in May, and we had some discussion during the meeting, and then we also, subsequent to the meeting, had received some comments. So we'll go through that briefly. And then, or the project team will rather, we collectively as a group. And then the project team will also present design concepts for reaches 10 and 11. That is upstream of Reach 6. The numbers go up as you go upstream. And then the group would like feedback on those priorities for next steps. This is, as a reminder, roles common to all of us participating. And then next slide. I think we're going to just dive right in unless anyone has any questions. And as a reminder, if you do have questions, you can raise your hand. There is a little icon. You should have a little icon on the bottom bar that says raise hand. You can also click Control-Shift-R to raise your hand if you're joining via the webinar. If you're on the phone, you can hit *6 to unmute yourself. And in this format, everyone can mute and unmute themselves. So also as a reminder, please make sure to mute yourself when you are not actively talking. We also have a chat and a Q&A should anyone want to put their questions or comments there. So I'll hand it over to the project team to go through the conceptual design alternatives for Reach 6, kind of that recap.
Awesome, thank you, Jenna. This is Aaron Peresky with Geosyntec, and I'm joined, our project team includes Joe Lewis from Geosyntec on my team, and then George Kelly with Bespoke Mitigation Partners, and Dave Biddlesbach from 5 Smooth Stones. And then Dave is joined by a couple of folks who've been working with him, including Amanthi and Basit. on the team. So you'll be hearing mostly from myself and Dave today, representing the project team. And our sponsor is Jen Shook with the County of Orange Mitigation Program, and she's been paying the bills for this work and keeping it moving forward. And so certainly welcome, Jen, for you to chime in on this as well.
Be off your phone, please. Okay, I want you off your screen.
I think
And just a reminder, if you're on the phone, you should be able to also mute yourself with *6. So if you don't mind, just making sure we're all muted. I don't know if I can mute. All right, go ahead, Aaron.
All right, thanks everyone. Let's go to the next slide. So this is basically a chance to just catch folks up, remember where we were. We spent about a little more than 90 minutes in our last meeting in May talking about the work that's been done over the last year, and that include some additional field reconnaissance efforts, including a fairly lengthy site walk in December of this last year. We talked about the restoration planning tools that we've developed over the last couple of years to support this design, and I'll go through a couple of those on the next slides. And then we presented to you all a few different concept alternatives for Reach 6, not intended to be project design alternatives, but rather concepts about how you could apply these restoration planning tools to this reach and how it could look, and you'll see some grading in these. You saw some actual design engineering features, and that's legit. It's but they're not final by any means, and this is intended more as a proof of concept to see how this can fit within the landscape in a fairly vetted way, rather than being a design proposal. So that's what we talked about last time. And so if we go to the next slide, we definitely have talked about this a couple times before, and it's pretty critical. A more complex channel design being the kind of the core of many of these design concepts that we're considering. Something that's smaller at its lower tiers to better support vegetation growth and keep the channel a little deeper and a little cooler during the summertime, etc. And we kind of compare and contrast this against a little simpler and a little bit larger design paradigm that was used in the course feasibility study. And the possibility here is to create something that is a lower limit of disturbance and footprint. So that's one of our planning tools. Go to the next slide. We talked about the mini regional curve, and that informs, of course, the dimensions of that four-tier channel concept. You've heard about that before. Last time we introduced a few different restoration paradigms referred to as priority 1, 2, and 3. And priority 1 is a reconnection to the existing floodplain, bringing the channel all the way back up out of its incised condition, engineering a new channel based on that four-tier concept, off to the side of the old channel, fully reconnecting it, and then filling in parts or all of the old channel, to basically give a fresh start for the channel and with a new shape that adjusts to its current hydrology. A priority 2 would be something where you're widening the inset floodplain and you're creating a relatively natural channel inside of an inset floodplain, but with a little bit more hardened outer limits because you're not able to let the water spread out as far. And then a priority 3 would be a situation where you can't really expand too much, and so you're making the most of what you have, which by creating some floodplain benches inside, but this one's going to require more hardening because there's less area for the water to spread out. So we talked through those concepts, and then we showed how those could be applied to Reach 6 last time. So if we go to the next slide. And then we talked about some of the components, the more biotechnical components that could be part of these designs. And these constructed riffles where you could adjust the size and of the boulders or the cobbles you're including in these to resist a wide range of shear stresses, a steeper slope with greater forces on it, or a shallower slope, as well as some biotechnical bank reinforcement that would be used. And so these the 5 smooth five Smooth Stones team configured into these design concepts. Go to the next slide. And so this is recapping from before, but we looked at four alternatives for Reach 6. I'll kind of just remind you of the two brackets that we put on this. The first end of the bracket was a priority 1 restoration, trying to get this channel connected back to its floodplain, back up on the floodplain, basically between the aqueduct structure and the confluence with Wood Canyon Creek, to basically restore the grade connection between the channel and Wood Canyon Creek and transition the aqueduct structure back over about 4,000 linear feet instead of the current 100 feet or so that the water takes to fall that 30 feet. So this results in a shallower slope and more floodplain reconnection, then transitioning back down into the inset floodplain at the lower terminus of this reach. And so we go to the next slide. This is the other end of the extreme, which would be to create a steeper and shorter section that would be balanced in cut and fill instead of requiring a lot of imported fill material. Would still maintain some degree of fish passage through the aqueduct structure and would limit the disturbance on the inset floodplain. So this basically gets the water over that very sharp grade transition over a longer length, about 800 feet instead of about 100 feet, and does it in a way that's controlled. And this would be more hardened in that area because there's a lot of energy in that section where the water's going to be going through that grade transition. But it's down into the inset floodplain more quickly while maintaining or while providing passage across that aqueduct structure. So these were the two ends of the spectrum we looked at last time, and we provided some compare and contrast on that. We go to the next slide. So this was some of the feedback we heard both during the meeting and through email follow-ups after the meeting. We definitely heard, our intent was to describe these as riffles and describe these as features within the system that help hold the grade together and help keep the system from down cutting again. Definitely not intended to be highly engineered grade controls, though, and that's an important distinction that we're on board with. We got a follow-up question on the fish passage design criteria used, and we clarified that this was targeted at steelhead and with preliminary pool depths and jump heights that were based on some design guidance out there. It's not intended to be the final statement on this, and this is something that would need to be looked at more to compare across different design guidance and make sure that this would provide enough passage in any condition.
Aaron?
Yeah,
it
go
looks
ahead.
like Chris Romberger, you have your name up or your hand up, sorry.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could offer a little bit more clarity in terms of what passage design criteria you're going to use. Will it be CDFW and NIF standards? And it seemed very wishy-washy as to what you guys are going to do. So, I mean, there's only a couple of documents out there.
Yes. So this is Dave, and so far what we've done is because we were doing fish passage for some work up in Canada, so we were using the spot model so far to look at fish passage, just kind of looking at standard salmonid stuff. But I'm not familiar enough with what people want to be using in California, so we're able to use another model if it comes up. We were just using the spot model because it's what we're using on another project at the same time. So.
Well, luckily, it's not super complicated. I mean, we're looking at velocities and jump heights, pool depths, that kind of stuff. But I think it's fairly clear when you get to the CDFW Salmon Stream Restoration Manual and some of the NIF standards. As long as whatever you're using is within those thresholds, we should be pretty comfortable with it.
Okay, good. And I think, what Aaron was trying to say is, as we continue on, that's going to be a really key point for us to incorporate. At this point, it was kind of, in a lot of ways, a little bit of an afterthought. We're like, okay, well, we want to make sure we're going to be able to design it for fish passage, but whatever the criteria is, we can incorporate that and change velocities, change depths a little bit later, but we need to at least get it in the right ballpark right now.
Sure. Yeah, sounds great. And I'm happy to work with you all on that a little bit if need be.
Thank you, Chris.
That would be excellent, Christian. It's definitely we'll have a spot where we try to find other things that people really want to make sure that get that next level of detail to move this forward, and that's certainly one that rises to the very top right now, as one to look into more detail. So, yeah, there was that was it. Thanks for interjecting. And Charles, you have your hand up too. Go ahead.
I just wanted to reiterate what Christian had said and support what he had said. It is very important. In the California Salmonid Stream Habitat Restoration Manual, there is a lot of engineering judgment that goes into creating these things. It is not to be designed from someone who has never designed anything in California before. I want to just make sure that we are clear on that the people who are doing this design have experience, because like I said before, we have an enormous amount of discharge variability in our streams in Southern California. You cannot come from Alaska or Europe and expect to know what goes on here in Southern California with a degree of expertise. So let's make sure we know what we're talking about. Thank you.
Yeah, one of our friends, I'm not a fish passage expert, but one of our friends is a fish passage expert. Her name's Ashley Fickey. She came through her schooling at UC Davis, and then got her PhD at Colorado State University. But she's probably most likely the person we would lean on from our team to do the fish passage stuff on here. And she's very familiar with Southern California fish passage of both kind of native and salmonids. So we haven't got her involved to date on the project yet because there hasn't been a huge role for her. But I agree with what you're saying. You need somebody that understands the systems there, and to look at a system and say, okay, well, I did fish passage in Alaska, so it must be the same as California. Doesn't make sense.
Thank you both. And I will just comment that you're probably thinking that the cart is before the horse, that some of this stuff should have been worked out before we're having this meeting. We are working on a fairly limited budget. We've tried to look at a lot of different concepts, and we're really looking at limits of disturbance. We're looking at grading. We're looking at how we could do cut fill. We're looking at the really big things to move around in the landscape and trying to present some proofs of concept for how these channel design criteria could be applied. And would appreciate the patience people have that this is by no means a work that's complete. We're not coming to you with a fully complete design that wants detailed comments. We're coming with our general concepts to try and get this sort of feedback out on the table. So I really appreciate the patience. And if you are wondering why some of this stuff is coming up and you're feeling like there's not an answer, it's simply because this is a work in progress and that we're early in the concept of, the process of turning field reconnaissance into a design concept. So I love all the feedback and not trying to stifle that at all. I just kind of want to, set the tone as we're fully open to things to look into in more detail. We're not going to try and defend a certain position on what is not really even a design yet in the call. So.
Aaron, and for the sake of time, we have 3 additional questions. If folks have or comments, if they're on Reach 6, because we're going through kind of the overview of what we talked about last time. We'll cover it here. If you have overarching comments or questions, we have some slides nearer to the end after we go through 10 and 11. If we could cover it there, just to make sure we have enough space for 10 and 11. I see Roger and Nicole.
Go ahead, Roger. I think you're first.
All right. Once again, Roger Buto, Clean Water Now. And Christian, thank you for having your camera on just briefly, so now I can put a face to the name that I've been corresponding with. The first thing I want to reestablish, just so that we're all clear and on the same page of life, because we do have some newbies. It was Clean Water Now starting in 2000. This is a historical fact. It was Clean Water Now starting in 2001 over some water rights issues with South Coast Water District, led to a 10-year battle to get this segment, the lower approximate 6 miles from Pacific Parkway down to the beach, granted distinct population segment whatever listing with NOAA and with National Marine Fisheries. I want to once again thank Christine Medic for her contribution at that point, and I think she well knows the history here. The reason I'm bringing this up is that there's some good news and bad news in this. The good news is we're thankful that finally it is being completely acknowledged that the aquatic marker species, the focal species for passage for that lower 6 miles, should in fact be the southern steelhead. So once again, we fought not only a 10-year battle, but to this day, that battle goes on with South Coast Water District. Secondly, very appreciative of your comments, Christian, and especially Charles Bussinger. Thank you for chiming in, Charles. Yes, I think it's critical that we have people that understand what the conditions are, what's optimal, including things like dissolved oxygen, temperature, a lot of the things that people apparently want to put on an off-ramp and park. I don't think so. I'm not saying you design this lower 6 miles around the steelhead. On the other hand, if that is the aquatic being referred to, that we be very clear as to what the goals and objectives are. As many know, I'm a Marine. I understand goals and objectives. What I don't understand are vague promises. And once again, 20 years later or more, actually, Clean Water Now, we're still committed because I'm still on this call, right? 25 years of watershed studies in South County and no major restoration or product. So I'm 75. I'm hopeful that I won't have to be in a veteran graveyard before something gets done in at least this watershed. Thank you.
Nicole?
Thanks. Aaron, I appreciate your explanation and your budget constraints. I was curious, I'm pretty new to the project. Who's paying for this and what the constraints are? And there's just seems like there's a lot of money out there right now. So if there's a way to get more money to get to a better project design, I was curious about that. And you don't have to go into that now. I know you're focused on Reach 6, but that was something that I was thought about last time and was curious since you brought it up.
I can provide a brief response to that. Jennifer Shook with the Orange County Public Works Mitigation Department is the project manager on the county side and has been able to allocate some budget to try to move project concepts to a point where there would be, a sponsor and somebody that would be willing to take it on, and that there's some concepts that are beginning to have traction. And we're hopeful that through this process, these last 2 meetings, we could start to arrive towards projects that would then be eligible for funding to move forward into design and then the necessary environmental permitting and so on. I think it's a fairly vague answer, but I would say that we are hopeful that through this process we can come to some really strong project concepts that then really just need money to move them to the next level of detail and get them going.
This is Jennifer. I just want to add to that. There's a number of regulatory drivers in the region, so we were just trying to, as Aaron said, identify some proof of concept ideas. And so with the limited funds that we have to do some of this exploration, we're trying to come up with some concept ideas. And then as we can find leverage partnerships and find the funding either for mitigation, I represent the mitigation program looking for compensatory mitigation opportunities. As there's grants available for fish passage, we may try to identify if there's segments of creek that we can improve for fish passage. So I can't talk right now. So we're just trying to identify the funding and partners and have a project concept far enough along, so we can bring it to a further design phase. So that's why this is all very high level right now.
And also, Nicole, welcome. One of the things I would like to just remind the group is, we're hoping that project concepts come forward earlier on in the design and development stages so that we can provide that space to get feedback earlier on before things are far more down the path, solidified and into permitting. So our intention broadly, not just with this project, but our intention broadly is to provide earlier access and availability so that people can provide some feedback and understand projects earlier on. And if there are things that people want considered, this may be a good time to make sure that's part of the conversation. So this is something that we are hoping to do for projects throughout the watershed. This is a major element of the watershed, representing most, if not all, of what you would consider the lower part of the Aliso main stem. So there's a lot to cover for this particular one, but that's why we're structuring it this way. All right.
Okay.
Roger, your hand's up, but I think that's from before. Okay. All right.
So
go ahead,
yeah,
Eric.
you've all been looking at this slide for a while. I probably don't need to read it. I just wanted to make sure we hear these, and this will be strongly considered in, as discussions move forward on developing certain concepts. So let's go on to the next slide. So this is where I'm going to take one more slide and then hand it off to Dave. And so go ahead, Andy, one more. So again, the purpose of these concepts is not to present a fully detailed design with every piece worked out, but it is to show proof of concept of how the 4-stage channel design, how the mini regional curve to set those channel dimensions, the size of it, could be applied to the landscape. And then also looking at the hard limits of these reaches. Where do we have culvert crossings? Where do we have grade control structures that are already in place, that we need to kind of work within, and how do you connect to existing grades? So we're trying to find projects that are standalone. They don't require the whole thing to be done in one fell swoop, but rather could be done in pieces to try and help break the logjam of funding and try to get things moving. So that's the intent of these concepts so far. And each one of them has more room to be refined, variations on it, and additional detail as they move forward. So with that, I'm gonna hand it off to you, Dave, to talk us through what you saw in the recon work that we did in Reach 10 and 11, and then some concepts for these.
All right, go ahead and let's move to the next slide. All right, so we're going to talk about Reach 10. We've actually broken this up into 3 sub-reaches inside of Reach 10, Reach 10A through C. Where we break it up into sub-reaches is really based on major changes in the way the river functions. So hard infrastructure, roadway, a bridge, maybe places where we're not free to meander anymore. Let's go to the next slide. So those are the reasons we break it up into multiple sections. So this shows Reach 10C, 10B, and 10A. It's currently an overwide system. It's constrained by a bike path on the west side and a service road on the east side, and it has hardened limits upstream and downstream. There's a structure in the middle of Reach 10A, so 10B to 10C. So let's move to the next slide. All right, so this is kind of shows you a little bit of the photos of what it looks like on the left. That's kind of an area downstream of Reach 10, and then we have riprap, grouted riprap in places, as well as concrete engineered drop structures near the middle of the reach. So it's a very urban influenced reach. You can see on the bottom right hand photo that the upstream bridge is in this reach, and that we have concrete and riprap without a whole lot of riparian vegetation. Let's go to the next slide. So one of the things that we want to be showing you is what could it look like to take one of these heavily urbanized reaches that is already over wide at low flow, narrow up the low flow condition, and then start to revegetate with riparian species while increasing the slope. And it's a balance because we don't want to add a whole lot more roughness in the raised flood stage. So we have to increase slope while we're adding roughness, and we want roughness because it's going to be a more naturalized reach. It's going to look more like a stream and less like an engineered drainage ditch. But this has a very large width to depth ratio on the bottom, and it's too wide for a channel associated with low flows. So in other words, low flow that comes through here just spreads out over the entire channel, and fish in some places, and I know this isn't true for the biologists on here, but for the average person, you'd look at it and say, well, a fish would need legs to be able to pass through this area because there's not enough room for it to swim. Now, fish are more creative than that. But let's move to the next slide. So our goals are really increasing vegetation along the banks, riparian vegetation, increasing fish habitat, making a little bit deeper low flow depth, increasing stability along the riverbanks, and it's also aesthetics as well as stability. So the stability isn't that bad in this reach. It's stable. It's just really ugly. And then providing a high profile pilot example. So the nice thing about this is it's in the middle of everything. If we do this one really well and can naturalize this system, then people will look at it and say, yeah, we can get excited about doing additional projects upstream or downstream. So our strategy is to narrow and deepen the primary channel, make minor widening of the bankful terrace. So basically add another terrace within here opposed to just being side slopes down to a big trapezoidal bottom, and then remove the top of the drop structure to create a more natural system. So our goal is when we're done, you won't be able to see this drop structure. We may do complete removal of the drop structure, but likely there's going to be some infrastructure tied into this drop structure that may limit us from doing complete removal. So we may leave it buried and just tie in a naturalized stream on top of it. So we wouldn't see it, but it'd still be there. Go to the next slide, if you don't mind. So what we're proposing here is just a little bit alternative, and a little bit of an alternative to the downstream option where we talked about 4-stage channel design. We're just talking about a 3-stage channel design. And the only difference is that we don't have quite enough room to put in a flood terrace and a floodplain. So we have to combine those two into one. And that's just because it's a narrowed, the reach is pretty narrow and through here opposed to being a wider floodplain reach. We do have some relic historic floodplain vegetation. We'd like to transplant everything that's there or reuse everything that's there. We don't have any desire to remove anything that's not invasive from the site, but a lot of the but some of the vegetation is invasive as well. So where it is invasive, we'd remove it and then replant with native species. Let's move to the next slide. Roger, do you still have your hand up, or is that from before? I assume it's from before. All right, so this is kind of a really rough profile of what we're looking at here. Did anybody else lose the screen right now?
Yeah.
I see a really nice picture of Aaron, but I'd like to see the screen. So there we go. Good. So reach 10A and 10C, the magenta line, and sorry for the colorblind folks, at about station 300 does represent the vertical drop. So in this place, we'd be looking to remove kind of the top of this definitely, maybe the entire structure, and then we'd be pushing the entire reach. Upstream of the structure would be a steeper slope with grade control structures that are represented by those green dots. And they're boulder constructed riffle features, should be nice habitat features for fish that could get into the reach. And then wood toe features on the outside of every meander bend, which will give us basically habitat on the outside of the meander banks for fish, both kind of native minnow species as well as larger bodied fish that would get up into this area. So we're looking at steepening the downstream slope and the upstream slope and removing the large drop structure. So this is the rough concept that we have in place for Reach 10. We'll move to the next slide. And you can see here where the existing ground is and where we'd be cutting into that existing ground. So this is kind of an idea of what it could look like to remove the drop structure. So it's kind of a square drop structure, and we'd be cutting off the concrete on the side. We'd be building a new channel down below, and we'd be doing a cutout from there, and then just be placing vegetation, transplants, and soil along the sides of it. So when we're done, you wouldn't notice that there's a structure underneath there, but the structure would be slightly underneath the invert of the channel. The reason why we'd keep the structure in place would be because, well, it just costs more money to remove it completely, and because we may have concerns of utilities or down cutting in the future for different reasons that we may just say, hey, it's nice to leave it in place. The reasons why we would take it out of place is because it does interfere with the hyporheic exchange of the riverbed, so it does slightly change the river processes in the river. So hyporheic exchange just means the water that pushes through the gravels and up wells in the gravels downstream, and that's really important for spawning of fish species that actually use the channel bed and the gravels in the channel bed for their spawning. So it ends up taking their waste away from where they lay their eggs, and that can be very beneficial. So there are reasons why we might want to have it completely removed opposed to partially removed. But nevertheless, it's going to be removed, and we don't want people to be able to see it anymore. Next slide. We'll have to assess the flood stage impacts here, and we'll get everything kind of revegetated with this stream that kind of comes through here with our artwork. But we don't expect that, because we're increasing the slope underneath the upstream bridge, and we're keeping the same water surface elevation at the bridge, that means that we should have a slightly reduced water surface elevation at high flows. And then down below, we may have a small area right below the structure where we have a slightly raised 100-year flood stage, but it's not going to be raised above what it is directly above the structure. So we don't perceive there being a big issue with increase in flood stage with the removal of this structure. Next slide. So what this looks like, and this is the proposed 3-stage channel, is it's really kind of enhancement of what's in place and bringing transplant materials, trying to stabilize the channel. So you can see how our proposed reach is only hidden about 10 foot wide at the base, whereas the current base of the existing channel is closer to 30 feet wide. So it's narrowing up that base flow significantly, but it's also keeping a smaller cross-sectional area in the channel, so we have a deeper flow of water at low flow. And we have most areas will be slightly raising up the bed of the channel on the downstream side, and then on the upstream side of the structure will be raising up, will basically be lower in the channel, and on the downstream side will be raising up the channel a little bit. So it fits well into the current floodplain, offering kind of more repairing stability. So it's still pretty stable as it is now, but this is going to give us more stability with natural materials. Let's go to the next slide. It's very easy to balance the grading on this one. Our final grading had us being kind of a net cut of 1,000 yards net cut, but we also know that we're going to be bringing about 1,000 yards of boulders, 1,000 tons of boulders for constructed riffles. So it ends up being one of these things where we're trying to be a little bit heavy on the cut, just so we have room to place the material that we'll be bringing in for habitat and for grade control. But the blue sections here are showing places where we have to fill greater than 1 foot of fill. The red areas are showing places we have to cut more than 1 foot of cut. And the green areas are places where we're within a foot of the existing grades. So any place that's green is where we could reuse the existing vegetation from. Next, let's go to the next slide. And this yellow line in through here, the yellow closed pike line, shows the area that we think could be hydrated after restoration. So this is the area that would become floodplain, opposed to right now it's just channel bottom. We think we can get revegetation on these areas, and we can have an improved floodplain in this area where there really isn't much floodplain vegetation. there's not hydric soils because it's mostly riprap, and it does have the hydro period, but it doesn't have the soils or the vegetation. We think we can plant vegetation, transplant some soils, and build soils over time. Let's go to the next slide. So in summary, we're looking at 3-stage channel design. It will be a lot more natural. It will be this narrow, deeper, low flow, less sedimentation, improved fish passage. It's going to completely change what this reach looks like. So it will be transformational for this reach. People will drive by and be like, wow, that looks a lot different. Some people will be like, that looks horrible. They let it go all natural and wild. And other people will look at it and say, hey, that looks wonderful. So some people will like it, some people won't like it. But we are talking about a partial removal of the drop structure to a full removal of the drop structure. But either way, you wouldn't be able to notice the drop structure when we were done with the construction. And we'll be able to have fish passage through the barrier for whatever large bodied species can get up through there, and promote riparian habitat as well. We do have to assess the flood stages, but we don't see that as initially being an issue here. And our fish passage is only as good as our downstream fish passage. So if this is done, but the aquip structure is still in existence, well, then it probably doesn't matter a whole lot for fish passage yet. Let's go to the next slide. So with that, I'm going to take about 3 seconds, and if nobody raises their hand, then I'm going to move on to reach 11. Give you the Jeopardy theme.
And we will have a chance to talk through both of these at the end, but
okay.
We do have one hand.
Susan?
Go ahead.
Yeah, just wondering on the last slide, can you clarify what you mean by less sedimentation? Is sediment still going to be able to pass through the channel, or are you meaning something else?
Yeah, so what we'll see is because of the overwide system, when the fine grained sediments from upstream come down to this reach, it's very wide, pretty shallow, and at low flow, there's not much velocity in through there. So we have a lot of fine grained sediments that settle out in this area and kind of form fine grained mucky film on a lot of the material. So from our standpoint, we're gonna be able to move some of that away to keep the riverbed a little bit free of that fine grained material on there. But it's also an important one to understand, because if we really want to be capturing some of that material, if that's important from a water quality standpoint, well, that could be a detriment to the design as well. But right now, our idea is that we're going to have at low flow to bank full, we're going to have a higher percentage of the wash load or the finer grain materials that will be able to get pushed through the system, because we're narrowing up the low flow and steepening the low flow. So it means we increase the depth and the slope of the low flow, which means we'll move more sediment through the reach.
Thank you.
All right, so we'll move on to reach 11A through E. So let's go to the next slide. And this reach is located basically right near the high school, and near the ball fields of the high school. And it's a very incised reach, so that just means that when we get to the annual high flows, it doesn't get anywhere near reaching the floodplain. There's exposed sheet pile in this reach, and there's significant lengths of exposed sheet pile that's about 15 foot in height in some of the places, and the channel is migrating towards the west or towards the high school. So that's kind of the potential of where the channel wants to be migrating if we did nothing. There's been a lot of hardening in place to the bike path that goes in between the high school and Aliso Creek. Added a lot of riprap, added, of course, the sheet pile, and there's a lot of hardening of the stream channel here to address the channel incision. We also have open space to the east, including the Lugano Canyon Foundation. I'm really sorry for my pronunciation of that, and the restoration area there on the right side of this picture, or on the left bank of the channel. Go ahead to the next slide. So our goals are to create a new dynamic, stable system, reduce risk to infrastructure preserve existing vegetation as much as possible, enhance wetland conditions in the floodplain. And I would also add another goal for this one, just happens to be that an educational classroom would be a really neat idea for here because we are so close to the high school. So to be able to put together a stakeholder group and build this into an outdoor classroom would make a lot of sense if it was feasible with the high school. Let's go to the next slide. And that was a picture of the sheet pile in the reach, by the way. So we have two concept designs that we explored. Both concepts include a 4-stage channel design, increased channel with the, so basically we increased the channel with the depth ratio and we buried the sheet pile. We moved the stream away from the west bank to give more protection to the bike pathway. What you're seeing here on the photo is the bike pathway and the riprap that was placed to protect the bike pathway on the right bank of the channel. And the concepts differ in the restoration style that we're doing and the uplift of the system and the areas that we have to disturb. So let's move to the next slide. So the first alternative says, let's bring the channel up as high as possible to the former floodplain. And with doing this, we're going to create a series of deep oxbows that we can't quite fill. So we're going to have a series of ponds, but we're going to reconnect the channel close to where the historic floodplain was. And that means some of the existing vegetation will be able to be reused, and vegetation that can't be reused will be easier to transplant because it'll be close to the elevation where it needs to be at. So we're going to end up increasing width to depth ratios in the new channel and the bank full flows, and we decrease the width to depth ratio of the low flows on the existing channel from the existing channel into the new channel. But here what we're showing is the yellow and black X line is basically the proposed grade of a new Thalwag design. Every place where it dips down and shows you a little triangle is where we'd be building a slack water pool in the system, and every yellow line in between is kind of the steepness of the riffles. Where we have green marks, this is where we'd have different structures to hold grade. And the purple line is about where the existing ground is. So you can see that we're trying to tie in pretty close to the existing ground. We're still in some places a couple feet off here and there where we're not connecting that closely to the existing ground, but it's within a range where we can still harvest and reuse a lot of the existing vegetation without having to completely destroy the existing vegetation. Let's move to the next slide. So this is what we're looking at. We're making a small channel that's lifted up to where it had been historically. You can even see some of the old relic drawls on that old surface up there. And we'd be raising a new channel up there. You can see this disturbance from where there was berms and levees and channelization done in the past before the channel had cut down. And then you can see how far the channel has cut down from that point. So what we're saying is that, you know, in the last 100 years, the channel had been up to close to where we're showing as proposed, and it has been manipulated and then cut down since that time. Whether it's 100 years, 200 years, there could be debate on that. But at one point, that flat valley at that higher elevation was formed by the river, active flooding on that surface. Let's move to the next slide. And anything that was not filled in would be left open as an oxbow. There'll be some places where we'd have to fill in the old channel, because if we left the whole old channel open, then there's no reason the water would flow in the new channel. So we have to put in some plugs through the old channel, and that requires a lot of fill when we do that. This completely kind of changes the look of this area, because we take upland areas that are currently upland vegetation, and we'll resaturate those soils. And as we resaturate those soils, it's very likely that we're going to reinitialize some wetland seed banks that have been dormant for a long period of time. And then we'll also reseed, and you're going to see a significant change in doing that. But with that, raising the flood stage, we also have to be, with raising the channel, we also have to be very careful about looking at the flood stage in through this reach. Let's move on to the next slide. With this alternative, what we're showing is any place that's red is places that will be cut greater than a foot. Any place that's blue will be places that will need to be filled greater than a foot. And you can see where we have one oxbow designed where it doesn't have to be filled because we're going to leave it as an oxbow. And then any place that's green, we could salvage the existing vegetation, reuse the existing vegetation on. So one of the big options on this alternative is this is going to create a series of larger ponds associated with this restoration. And even if we wanted to bring in less fill, we could create more ponds. So there's options of creating more ponds with this reach and with this design. And a lot of it is defined on how do we want the reach to look. If we hadn't historically had this many oxbow ponds, do we want to currently have this many oxbow ponds? Is it worth having more oxbow ponds so we can get more floodplain connectivity and more floodplain function? Or is it better to try to balance material, lower the stream profile so we can fill in those oxbow ponds? And this is the limited disturbance that we have of the existing vegetation with rerouting the channel without just trying to stabilize the channel in place, which is what we've been fighting for years. If we move to the next slide, this gives you what the area of hydration is. What this means is that all of this area plus any oxbows to the right of where the old channel is could be designed as wetland. And basically we could revegetate it. It would have the right hydro period. And then we could in time build hydric soils through water being in the right vegetative communities with the right hydro period, and we could build hydric soils in time. So that's a significant change in the landscape from what a lot of that is currently upland areas now. Let's move to the next slide. The priority 2 restoration, the next alternative is a priority 2 restoration, transition from a priority 1 to priority 2. And all we're trying to do here is saying, we're going to keep the channel about the same alignment, but we're going to lower it quicker so we can balance material so we don't have to leave open any oxbows. So we don't have to leave open any of those deep pond areas. So our bank full width is still the same at 26 feet, but it's somewhat lower in elevation to reduce the net fill needs. So if we go to the next slide, what this shows is that instead of tying up to that higher surface at about elevation 178, we're now creating a new floodplain elevation at lower elevation around 172, and it's still higher, the invert's still higher than the existing invert, but the floodplain is lower than the former floodplain. So it's kind of a combination between what we described as a priority 1 and priority 2 restoration. But the benefit of this is that it does completely balance material. So if we move to the next slide, this shows an area, and if you look at station 250 to 300, there's a little section there where the green line stays within about a foot of the black line or the proposed line. Those areas, we can reuse all the vegetation we want in that area. But wherever we go significantly greater than a foot above or below, we're either going to have to transplant it and put it in a skid steer or a front end loader and move it as mats, which we do on a fairly often basis, or we're going to just remove that vegetation. So it becomes more costly to transplant it and just more difficult to keep the transplants alive. Let's move to the next slide. So what we're showing here is you can see where there's a lot less green on this slide than there was on the last slide. And the green being the areas where we can kind of leave the existing vegetation and kind of grade around it, and we don't have to really disturb the existing vegetation. So this swath is like a big swath of disturbance. Now, that doesn't mean we can't use transplants and that we can't reuse material and we can't make it look natural, and it will grow and it will look natural in a number of years, but you're not going to have, 50-year-old trees out there. And not that you have a lot of 50-year-old trees out there now, but you're not going to have 50-year-old trees out there because a lot of them are going to have to be filled in because they're right near the existing riverbed. So that's the disadvantage of the alternative 2. The advantage of alternative 2 is there's no material that needs to be brought in site, no material that needs to be brought out off site. It's completely balanced. So we just can grade it by bringing in the materials for habitat like the boulders, and then reuse the wood that we're taking down in the outside of meander banks. and then replant. So let's move to the next slide. You notice the hydration area is slightly smaller on this one than it was on the other alternative. And that's just because we're not bringing the channel back up. We're only dealing with the zone where we have a floodplain that can be hydrated. So it's a little bit smaller hydrated area, and the margins around the alternative one will be a lot more questionable on whether they get hydrated or not. Whereas here, the margins around this alternative won't be hydrated. It's lower. We're not going to hydrate those areas. Let's go to the next slide. So this gives you kind of a comparison of the hydrated areas between the two. And then also in zone 1 hydrated areas, we also have all of the existing channel that could be hydrated because we bring the channel back up. So alternative 1 has a larger hydrated area than alternative 2. And it's somewhere between slightly to significantly larger. We would expect that it's going to be a little bit different to walk down to alternative 2 and see a hydrated area opposed to just walk across a flat surface and see a hydrated area in alternative 1. But alternative 2 will be a lot easier to design for flood stage reduction, whereas alternative 1 is going to be harder to balance the flood stage on that design. So, all right, let's move to the next slide. So in summary, they're both 4-stage channel designs. They're going to be more natural stream with greater stability. It's going to increase the width to depth ratio of the bank flow channel, decrease the width to depth ratio of the low flow channel. It's going to realign the stream to a new higher floodplain terrace. It's going to bury the sheet pile, increase floodplain connectivity, both of them will increase wetland connectivity and wetland function, increase vegetation potential for revegetation, and the alternatives will differ in net fill requirements, disturbance to existing vegetation, and the width of the floodplain corridor. So next slide. I think I'm back to you, Aaron. Is that correct for questions?
Yeah, I think we're pretty much close to done. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide, Andy. So yeah, we wanted to get these in front of you. As Jenna said, getting things in front of this group early in the process, not for approval, not for, I want to see this change from this detail to this detail, but rather big picture stuff. What did you like about the presentations? What did you like about the concepts? What big picture things would you like to see considered as these move forward? And what questions do you have to just understand them better? That's the nature of the feedback we're really hoping to get from you all today, and in the email follow-ups that happen. And we're working on, deciding how to use the available budget for this coming, few months. And we'll have a chance to dig into some of these that are prioritized by the group and have one-on-one meetings as they would benefit this. So I'm going to stop there and let the hands go up. Christian.
I did like the thought or the drop structure, at least modifying it to be able to get aquatic species over it or around it. I think that's going to be a challenge, but I think you all should consider that, we don't just have strong swimmers like salmonids in this area, we probably have other species that are less strong. So consider that those should probably be taken into account to a certain extent, and make sure that we can get, other species over such a change. I look forward to that portion. I think that could be really interesting. I guess my concerns, I do like the idea of having more of spread out floodplain, at least within river banks. I guess my concerns lie along the lines of, I can see there being flood protection issues, especially if you realign that reach 11. It looks like the creek wants to go straight into the high school, basically, and I'm not sure realigning it like that would actually change what the stream is trying to do, because of its kind of natural kind of way it's flowing that direction. If you get a high flow event with a lot of energy, it's going to push right on back. But I mean, I think it is really interesting for you to consider a lot of the concepts where there's a lot more of a natural and kind of letting the stream play out a little bit more. If we force water to do something, it might not do that. But if we allow it to construct a little bit more and kind of be part of that process, we could see better long-term results. That's what I'm thinking about, is like, how do we make sure these results are long-term and benefit habitat and species in a larger time scale?
Yeah, so I agree with your thoughts in the sense that we want to make sure that we're benefiting species in a long-term time scale. And one of the big things that we look at is central tendencies of rivers. So if there's a central tendency of a down valley meander migration, like we would call it, going into the school, if you will, there has to be something that in the flood flows is going to discourage that down valley meander migration. So if we just design a channel and then the flood flows are kind of still pushing the same direction, then I agree with you. It's going to go right into the school and it's going to kind of continue to cause problems for us. So we, in the past, when I deal with super complex design projects, we will run 2D and 3D hydraulic models for the flood flows. And I'm not sure if a 3D hydraulic model would be warranted on this in later design phases, but we'd probably definitely run a 2D hydraulic model just to verify how the energy will be distributed during higher flows, to basically say, okay, well, if we have a high energy pocket right near the roadway at the school at a higher flow, then what can we do to regrade that area to reduce the energy or basically push the energy over to the left side of the valley? So I think in later design phases, we can evaluate that risk and uncertainty and say, hey, what can we do? One of the problems that I have with gently nudging a river to move in a certain direction is that in the past, this river wasn't gently nudged. It's in this location because somebody pushed it in this location. There's evidence of berms, there's evidence of dredging. So at some point, if somebody's old enough around here, they probably even have a memory of when somebody moved a section of this river. So for us to say, okay, well, the river is there now, it makes an assumption that the people before us really knew where the river was supposed to be and that the river's not trying to move in a different direction. So, but I agree with you. They're all one of the big things that we do in the next phase of work after a pre-master plan is what we call a master plan. And with the master plan, we look at trajectory analysis from a geomorphology standpoint. So that says, this is where the stream is now. If we do nothing, it's going to traject and move to this direction. And then if we do this alternative, we would expect that it would project and move in the trajectory towards this direction. So that's usually in a master plan phase to a concept design phase, opposed to being earlier in the process. But your thoughts are well noted. So.
Yeah, I look forward to the modeling efforts you guys move forward with. I think probably some more natural energy dissipators incorporated into future design, or more, I guess, in-depth design would be helpful in terms of some of those issues. Whether they be willow or rock or what have you.
Sorry, Christian, are you talking about kind of a floodplain roughness energy dissipators or in-channel energy dissipators?
Yeah, to a large extent, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think that a lot of things that we do, bundle cut-ins for the floodplain roughness, as well as silt trenches for the floodplain roughness, and then also dead branch cut-ins for the floodplain roughness. All these things are great for building roughness when we have concerns about the shear force on a floodplain, and we have to basically put like a speed bump in the floodplain. Those are all things that are good, but they also all raise flood stage a little bit. So it's a balancing act. This is not going to be as simple as something down in Reach 6 where we don't really care that much about flood stage, or something in Reach 10 where we know we're going to reduce flood stage regardless of kind of what's being done because we're taking out a big structure. So this one is a more complicated balance for flood stage.
Chris?
Hi, yeah, this is a little bit of a continuation of the conversation, I think. I think I'm going kind of in the same direction as the previous Chris was. In Reach 11, actually to some extent in both Reach, it looks like you're kind of forcing a meander throughout the Reach that looks pretty tight, you know, compared to the, well, at least existing condition, if not, I assume that there was kind of some wider meanders through this area where the high school is now. But I guess I'm a little concerned about it, you know, the kind of forced meander, tight meander widths. And, you know, it doesn't seem likely that that's going to stay. And, you know, I guess I would discourage kind of fixing the stream in place, you know, with you know, woody structures kind of throughout, although I mean I appreciate wood as opposed to cement, but it seems like that would, you know, the stream's going to want to go where it's going to want to go. And I was wondering, you know, since it is, the proposal is really to just start over again, and, you know, redelineate the low flow channel throughout the entire length, you know, which would result in the loss of the habitat that's there now. I was wondering if, you know, we couldn't consider maybe a lighter touch with, you know, taking out some of the higher land areas, existing land areas where, you know, the stream probably did not flow historically, and using that fill to kind of fill. It looked like you have a really highly variable low flow elevation throughout the Reach, and maybe use that to fill some of those, you know, some of those areas and create another channel, especially in the one kind of large meander you have, just to create more capacity and another flow path for water, and to increase, you know, your wetland area, but without kind of taking out all of the existing older trees that have been there since, you know, since this channel was reset probably in the 60s, 70s, I guess.
Yeah. No,
And there is, by the way, there is really good historical flyovers from, and I'm trying to think who the consultant was that did that, but I've seen there a historical flyover of the entire length of this creek where they, I don't know how they did it, but they had, you know, they were showing the historical channel configuration before development in this area in a video.
yeah, and we had reviewed that document as well. So, you know, a couple things that I would say is your concept of, hey, can we just reconnect to some of the old channels? Yeah, definitely we can. The issue that we get into is we're such an incised Reach. So then the risk of trying to do something like, you know, an old beaver dam analog or something like that, which we've done a lot of different places, become very difficult just because you're building something that's 25 feet in depth, and, you know, it's a permeable dam, which is going to be pretty high risk, and you're talking about in urbanized areas. So if the dam does fail and then causes another failure to the next dam and then another failure to the next dam, then you have a large debris blockage down at your first bridge, and you cause flooding to there. So there is definitely a risk to not having hardened engineered design in through here. So if we are going to connect up to some of those historic channels at those higher elevations, we'd probably have to do a manipulation over something like a beaver dam structure where we'd actually build a berm to hold that wood in place, opposed to just build, you know, kind of doing something and nudging the channel into something that's a little bit more stable and better connected to the floodplain in time. Just because we do have risk of a lot of homes and property and things around this one. So the meander pattern, to address the meander pattern, there's nothing set in stone for the meander pattern that we put in there. we used a reference from channel dimension on other references nearby to be able to say, hey, this is a meander pattern that could go on to the channel. Now, the historic meander pattern of the stream, as you can see from the historical, from the Tetra Tech report that was produced years ago, you can see the historical meander pattern and the spacing of kind of outside of meander bend to outside of meander bend that has significantly increased in length in conjunction to the down cutting of the channel. So as a channel cuts down, has less connection to the floodplain, then it generally also cuts across steep areas, has a head cut, and then becomes straighter. So part of what we're seeing is the fact that we have a deeply incised channel, so it looks like it's really, really straight in general. And that doesn't mean that we don't have to stay at the pattern that we proposed, but we do want to propose the idea that we're going to be adding sinuosity to it, because we're going to have to add some sinuosity to this, or else we're going to have to come up with a slightly different alternative, because the sinuosity on this reach is pretty far away from reference criteria of channels that are well connected to floodplains in the region. Now, for like a beaver dam analog system, if we design that, and when we design beaver dam analog systems, which I've done a bunch of them in the past as well, you put in kind of a series of check dams made out of wood, and you could just do a check dam made out of anything. And then you allow the area to hydrate, and then in time you expect it to kind of reform a low flow channel, and that would have a sinuosity associated with it as well, but you don't design that sinuosity. You kind of nudge it, or what some people call, you train the river, kind of push in the right direction and let the river take the rest away. And I think those alternatives could be evaluated, but it is a lot higher risk. And those alternatives are generally not suggested for areas that are urbanized. So the folks from the Forest Service do not suggest beaver dam analogs for urban environments. For Janine Castro and others that wrote that manual years ago. So those are the things that we're looking at, but don't think that the sinuosity or the pattern of the stream is set in place. Probably what we would do is say, this is the sinuosity that we think we need to balance the sediment transport material. And we've even had some charrettes, design charrettes, where we've said, this is the length of stream. Now you guys put your fingers on where you think you want the stream to go, and then let's try to fit the stream in there. So we've had a lot of ways where we've dealt with that with stakeholders in the past. But what I do want you to realize is that if we move to be in better connection of a floodplain, a smaller channel, we're probably going to also have a higher sinuosity than what is currently out there.
Okay, I just want to correct one thing that you said, which was not consistent with what I was thinking, and that is just that I'm not suggesting putting it back in an old channel, because I think the old channel was probably like where the high school is. I was suggesting, carving a new channel. I guess that would be to the east of the existing channel, through the high section where you had proposed to put it, but without just creating a brand new low flow through the whole section. So just adding another channel, and I don't know if you would use some of that fill to fill in the existing low flow so that you can get it a little higher up, and add your I'm not exactly sure what a beaver analog is, but but add woody debris and whatever fill that you're taking out of this higher up area and use it to fill your incised channel, to bring it up a little bit so that you have, increased, the water flow areas, by having multiple channels, but not, but that way you wouldn't have to kind of take out all of the existing habitat to create a brand new low flow through the whole section.
Yeah, so I think I understand what you're saying now. What you're saying is build a new side channel, and then you can leave the existing habitat that's there, and you just do some grade control structures in the existing channel to push water into the new channel.
Correct.
Okay.
And even, you know, use both channels, but you know, fill the old channel so that it's not, you know, at the same elevation as it is now, so that you can, you'd probably have to do some structures to make that happen, but at least you'd have additional capacity, you know, creek channel capacity, because you do have these higher elevation areas, you know, 2 existing bars that you have land available to use for your flood capacity that could be highlighted.
Yeah, and I think in a lot of ways, that's kind of an alternative that could fall in between our 2 alternatives that we proposed, because you're essentially still having a series of connected oxbows on the one side, because you have deeper water than kind of standard riverine water there, because you're using grade controls to back up the water so you can get water into your other channel, and then you have at least seasonal flow through the other channel. So I think there's a feasible option there. We'd have to see if it met the whole team's goals and objectives, but I think there'd be a feasible option. There are some issues with that when it comes to sediment transport concerns, but you're a low sediment transport supply reach here. So if we address some of the localized areas, it's probably going to be something that we could work with on these upper reaches in the urban area. You know, I'd love to, you know, from my standpoint for Reach 11, I would love to create something where you could work with the high school, have kind of a series of littoral areas that are both oxbow ponds, vernal pools for different amphibian habitats, as well as a stream feature, maybe an overflow bypass channel, and then show transplants, show existing vegetation being avoided, and then also show kind of replanting. And I could see there being a really neat opportunity for educational things here, as well as, you know, 319 funding from an educational grant with a high school. I think that would be kind of a neat potential alternative, and I think that could fall somewhere in between option 1 and option 2 as well. So I think there's a lot of alternatives between our option 1 and option 2, and there's some alternatives that are just not even between there that could be done and feasible.
Assad?
Yes, my main question was going back to Reach 10A and C. And the Reach 10A to C, you guys said the bike path was in the way, if I'm correct, to make the slope, the channel shallow, if I'm correct.
Yeah, right now the bike path is one of the constraints of the reach. Our reach for our concept design currently for Reach 10 does not have us taking out the bike path. It just has us raising up the channel closer towards the bike path. So it limits the drop we have to take on the side slopes. So it means we can flatten the side slopes.
Now, I was going to ask, what would be the benefit of flattening the side slopes?
So right now you have riprap on there, and riprap you don't need to flatten the side slope for riprap. But if we want vegetation to grow back on those side slopes, we need to have a little bit of a flat bench, and we need to have a little bit flatter side slope so we can get vegetation established on there. So that's the benefit for flattening the side slopes, is being allowed to establish riparian vegetation on those side slopes, opposed to riprap. We could also do joint planting on the existing riprap slopes and just kind of raise up a floodplain. But, you know, it's going to be a little bit of a more natural feature and natural feel by replanting the side slopes and kind of filling on top of the riprap, or resloping them, than just kind of putting joint planting inside there. So we don't need to. But if we're trying to naturalize the reach, there's a value in doing so, because the existing soil will not withstand the side slopes that are out there right now without major reinforcement.
Naturalizing reach has value. Now, I remember on one of the, I'm trying to remember because you guys, well, the presentation went too quick as I was trying to catch the info. But another one is, I saw on the logo that Smooth Stones is Restorations is in charge of the project, if I'm correct.
No, we are, I'm with Five Smooth Stones Restoration, and we're a subcontractor to subcontractor to an engineering firm that's working for the county. So we are definitely not in charge of the project, but I can answer questions related to the company if you have questions related to the company.
I was gonna ask, what is the objective of the company? What does the Smooth Stones do? Like what their projects or duties are as a company?
Yeah, so we do a lot of river restoration projects, wetland restoration projects for the purpose of mitigation, property protection, fisheries improvements. We've been blessed to be able to work on about 200 construction projects over the past 20 years, and that I've been working on things. Our business has been in business for 7 years, Five Smooth Stones Restoration, but I am the owner and the primary engineer at the business. So I've been involved in a number of projects since then. But we do geomorphology and river engineering work.
Fair enough.
Chris Medak, did you have another question or was your hand up from before? Okay, thank you. Do we have any other questions? We're coming up on, we have about 5 more minutes left. So do we have any last questions for the project team?
Yeah, I did. I just wanted to make sure I had a chance possibly to ask you guys about this, or we could talk about this generally now or later. But I do have some major concerns for down on Reach 6 and the replacement of that structure. I wasn't able to make the last meeting, but it sounded like you all were only going to go for a 10 or 15-year flow event, be able to pass underneath it. Is that something we can talk about now, or would you rather we talk about that later?
No, yeah, we'd intended to respond to that earlier, Christian, but we got caught on that slide.
No worries. Yeah.
The design concept of the more Arizona crossing style was just intended to show a lower cost option for maintaining the maintenance access and still being able to pass the geomorphically significant flows, but providing a longer and higher span in that reach to pass larger flows would be technically feasible. It would just add cost to the design. So one of the things that we were going to look at moving forward was just to get a cost comparison, see how much that changes the dynamic on cost.
It looked like it was like 120 feet or so. Is that a rough estimate, or from the road running through the park there to the maintenance road across the creek?
Yeah, I think that's a decent estimate. From top of sort of relic floodplain to the other side of the relic floodplain, about 100 feet or so. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess like my main concern in terms of considering a larger option would be that, if we constrain the creek again, we create the opportunity for another velocity issue, which would downcut again if in a higher flow. And so that would render any sort of restoration we did down, below that bridge, that point, potentially impacted by higher flow, downcut again, kind of creating the same problem we're having already. And so I just was hoping that maybe, we could think about avoiding that from a long-term perspective. And there are quite a few monies around right now for restoration and infrastructure stuff like this. So I would encourage you all to look into that a little bit more deeply. I think considering a bigger flood event below that would be a really powerful consideration. I know NIFWIF has some opportunities for funding right now. I know, Proposition 168 are open for, should have solicitations in the next year or so. But if you guys want to talk about that more, I'm happy to. I just think that if we want to see restoration, continue this restoration rate stay there, we should think about having a wider span.
Christian, we do plan to reach out to you. I know we've had an initial call, and that's part of what we're looking at through this process is identifying grant funding and seeing. I know traditionally a lot of funding hasn't been available for planning. It's usually shovel-ready projects, but it seems that more funding is now out there for planning. So we've been exploring those options, and I know we were trying to set up a call with Dave Mayer, I think, a while ago, and he ended up being really busy, but you have offered to us before, and we do plan to take you up on it, so thank you.
Yeah, please reach out. I'm happy to talk with you or explore options, whatever have you, and happy to be of assistance in this regard.
Absolutely, thank you.
Thank you.
I do want to just add, though, to what Christian said about the bridge. Actually, if you have a higher bridge, which is intended to pass all of the flows beneath it, you could end up constraining the flows, causing higher velocities. I know, and I'm saying this because in Africa, where I was there, they actually tended to build very low bridges that were intended to pass the flows over the top so that they would not constrain the flows, so that it would flow across the entire width of the floodplain. And so that's something you have to be really careful about when you when you look at the the velocities under the bridge, under a higher bridge. If it's still narrow, it just makes it go faster and not ever be able to expand out beyond the width of the bridge. So just something to think about. When I was looking at that bridge design that you had, I thought, well, that's great, because if it only can pass the 5-year flow, it's just going to all flow over the top, and then it won't increase the velocities too much, because it'll just spread out around it. So anyway, just you have to look at the flows all the way around the bridge, not just under it.
Yeah, and I would hope that would get taken into consideration in terms of modeling and the impacts of having a smaller versus a larger crossing there. I think definitely something we should look at, basically.
Yeah, I think it depends a lot on what happens downstream. I mean, if you're going to if you need to put the creek into a bit of a defined section to make up that drop fairly quickly, and you want to try and limit the foot distance of disturbance, spreading it out only to bring it back in may not make sense. But if you're going to try to spread it across the full floodplain, so that is what a 2D model would help with a lot, would be to understand where the water would spread and where the velocities would be, and be able to target your armoring and target your, basically target a design that reduces the need for armoring through the modeling.
All right, so as timekeeper, we are at 3:30. So I wanted to just, the next slide, I believe, is next steps, Aaron.
Yep.
Go ahead, Andy. Okay, so this is for the whole group, not just for this project. We did have a slowdown during the pandemic, and we're picking back up again. This project, because of its size, and I'm saying project in terms of talking about the entirety of the lower 6 miles, but this is obviously being kind of broken up. Because of its size, we've been talking about it for the last couple of meetings. However, we do anticipate having more regular meetings over the next year, and we hope to see other come forward. We had mentioned on the last at the last meeting that we would send out a survey because it was tight between the two meetings. We decided to send it out after this one to help us planning for the next year from now. And to echo what has been said, there's a lot of funding out there. So we're hoping that other projects, we can kind of walk through projects similar to what we're doing right now within the watershed to help queue up some of these projects for grant funding. I think a lot of these discussions really help with bringing out all of the benefits that projects can achieve and where they might best align with funding opportunities. So we'll be working to prepare for other projects to come forward. This is again a reminder to the group that we want you to reach out if you have any ideas or project concepts you want to talk about. It does not have to be formal. It can be very informal, but again, we just want to make sure everyone knows that that's what this group is intended to do. So you'll see a survey that touches on that very point. So we ask that folks turn that around so we can consider your input on what would be most helpful to you, to your organizations, to projects that you want to see. To points made earlier, we all want to see the projects. We want to see more projects constructed, and because of the amount of funding that's out there, facilitate as best we can. So the other related specifically to the lower 6 miles, we would ask that folks provide additional comments on the conceptual alternatives and some of those priorities for the designs. We do want to make sure that if you didn't get a chance to provide your comments in the chat today, and you want to email us, we'll queue you up to do that. We'll also make available the notes from this meeting and the recording if you want to revisit that to provide your comments. Do we have another slide, Andy? I think that's it.
You do not. That's the last slide.
All right. So again, thank you to everybody for participating today. I know these are kind of fast and furious. We wanted to be responsive to the group. Everyone said no long meetings. So we're trying to be short and sweet. But that does mean that in some cases you'll have to provide comments kind of in between. And that's why we're doing the survey outside of the meetings. So please take advantage of that opportunity to give us your feedback. We want this group to serve you as much as as we can for the projects. And if you have any questions about the group for some of the new folks, feel free to reach out to us. Our contact will be on the meeting information. So thank you very much, everybody. Happy summer.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Appreciate the input today.